Hey guys, this is Kenjiro and welcome to another PaintShop Pro video. Today we're going to be looking at a few techniques on how to change the mood of an image. And we're going to be looking at three somewhat closely related types of approaches, but across three different images. And in this particular context, when I'm talking about mood, I am addressing the idea of how does the viewer feel just generally in viewing the image. There's a lot of different ways to adjust mood of a given image, but this video is primarily going to look at the way that we can affect mood but with color. So for this first technique, we're going to use this image that you see here. This first technique is going to primarily rely on white balance adjustment. Now looking at this image, as I always like to talk about image selection, I think this image lends itself really well to something I've seen that's kind of like called the sunset effect. And essentially it just really emphasizes a sort of sunset feel. I think it's the whole point of that effect is to adjust the mood in that way. For folks who are very familiar with photography, you understand how to use white balance, and maybe this will become really obvious. But I just want to clarify, a lot of times white balance is used for the purpose of trying to get accurate color, and I have no doubt that this image that we're starting with has accurate white balance already applied to it, but we're going to be using white balance to suspend reality for a little bit to enhance a more warmer kind of sunsetty mood. So now to make the comparison of the before and after a little bit easier, the first thing I'm going to do is come over to the layer palette, right click and duplicate. And then because I'm going to be applying a few effects on it, I'm going to put it in its own layer group. So we can go down here to the layer button and then select new layer group, and if you hold shift it won't bring up the dialog box, so it saves you a little bit of step there. And then we'll see that our duplicate is nicely encapsulated in this group. So now I'm going to select that copy layer, and then what we're going to do is come over to adjust white balance. And there's a lot of controls here. I think by default it may show up looking like this for you. If you want a little bit more control, you can click on the advanced options, and then you can see there's a lot of different ways that you can adjust the white balance. And again, a lot of these adjustments are primarily to try to take the existing lighting and correct for it to get the appropriate white balance. But what we're trying to do is kind of, in this case, for example, I'm pulling the white balance way to the right, way to the warmer region, to try to modify the feel of the picture. So what we can see now when we do this comparison is that if I remove the effect of the white balance, it has it's a very accurate morning-y time kind of a feel, but it doesn't really have quite that real warmth there. And just by pulling the temperature of the white balance to the warmer side, you can see it has this sort of warming effect. So then once you've kind of pulled, the temperature meter to a level of warmth that you appreciate for the image you're working on, you can click OK. Keep in mind, we are assuming that we're starting with an image that has a correct white balance. So if you have an image that's already, kind of misaligned white balance wise and on the warmer side, this doing what I just did might be a little too extreme, but it's all to your preference and what you like. So the next thing we want to do is we want to sort of enhance the sort of glow of the sky, and this is sort of a key aspect of sort of that sunset effect that I had seen in another image. So what we can do is come down here and say new raster layer, and then select our paintbrush. And then really all we want to do is just find like a nice, yellowy, orangey color, that might represent, roughly what you want this sky to be. And then what we're going to do is change this raster layer's blend mode to overlay. So now making it a little bigger, hardness being low, I think in this case is good because then it'll kind of have a more natural gradient blend to it. And then we just want to kind of start painting in the sky region here, and you'll see it kind of has this effect of really adding this sort of like glowing sky. And if you're wanting it to blend down a little bit further but not be so intense, you can always reduce the opacity and then start painting a little bit lower. That might have been a little too much. And then what you start to see is that, it really complements that sort of, white balance warming that we did earlier. Like I would almost say that maybe without this little extra bit of like sunset enhancement, that the white balance just created this sort of color cast, instead of really changing the feel of the image. But then by now enhancing the sky to make it feel like, hey, no kidding, there's this bright, warm sun behind this woman, that that white balance adjustment doesn't feel so out of place. So now if we compare this image that we just modified with the original, this original still feels like a morning sun, kind of shot, and probably colored mostly by the sky. And this has the same kind of image, but just has a much warmer feel. So that's the white balance technique. Let's do something similar now, of still kind of warming in a way, but using a different technique. All right, so for this second technique, we're going to do something similar where, we're starting with a very grayish, bluish, greenish, predominantly kind of image. And we want to kind of give it a warmer feel, but maybe instead of a sort of sunset, warm kind of feel, this is more of like let's create like a fall theme, right? Again, suspending reality, but just focusing on how we want to change the feel of an image. What we're going to do for this approach is use the Hue Map. So once again, to make the demonstration of the difference between the before and after, we're going to duplicate, and then we're going to create a new layer group so that the layer group encapsulates all the things that we're going to do to change. We're going to select our copy of the background. And then we're going to go to Adjust, Hue and Saturation, Hue Map. And so what, I have some presets here just to make my life a little bit easier. I called it Fall Colors. And to explain, before we get there, to explain the way the Hue Map works is essentially you can see it as this top row lists the hue that you might want to modify, and you can see there's sort of a discrete regions of color that would be affected. And then the bottom row shows what those colors are mapped to. And so in this case, in the default setting, red maps to red, orange maps to orange, etc., etc., etc. But for example, if I want to say for every blue in the image, I want it to map to red, then what you can do is you can start changing what the source is to point to a different color. Right? It has a different target color. So in this way, this is an example of just in general being able to modify the color of something in the image without having to necessarily like paint over it or do blend modes or anything like that. It literally just allows you to map via a slider. What you have to keep in mind though is unless if you do selections or something or masks or something like that, it's going to affect every pixel, that's blue or green or whatever hue. It's going to affect every pixel in the image. So having now explained how the Hue Map works, like I said, I had a preset, and what the takeaway here with this sort of preset you'll see here is that in surveying the full spectrum of the rainbow on top, what I've done is mapped every single one of those colors to some sort of fall-ish color, right? Red, orange, or yellow, or something, within that range. And in doing so, you end up with this image here that has, a much more fall-ish kind of color and feel to it. Now, granted, brown jeans are probably not a common thing, and maybe they don't exist at all. I don't know. But again, we're the goal here is we're kind of suspending reality to some degree for the purpose of trying to achieve a specific kind of mood. So you'll have to kind of decide, how much reality you want to suspend in pursuit of achieving that mood change. But you can see how you could create your own color themes here, right, to produce a certain kind of image. Now, one other detail I do want to point out, because I think this is key, especially when you're dealing with portraits, is you'll notice that I barely modified the ranges for the red, orange, and yellow, and it worked out in this case. Because when you start playing with these regions, that's when skin tones start to get all messed up, and then your reality suspension might not work out, or you'll have to mask those regions. But in this case, in trying to keep it simple, I just made sure to leave those alone, and then only modified the colors that happen to be in the background. And so this image worked out really well for that approach. So now that we've done that sort of, adjustment, you could say in general, this already kind of achieves this change in, look and feel. But, we can do some very similar things like to what we did before, where we can add, another raster layer and maybe put, we'll use the flood fill tool and, just kind of fill this whole area. And primarily what we're going to strive for here is maybe like this area up here feels like it could be a little bit more orangey, like if we're kind of going back to that whole sunset sky thing, maybe it'll look a little bit nicer if this has more of an orange feel rather than this muted red feel. So we could pull in a new layer, and actually maybe instead of flood filling, let me try this again. Again, we can just paint with our paintbrush again. But instead of doing overlay, so we can have a slightly less intense effect, we can just paint like with soft light, and you can see how that just kind of has this sort of feel of adjusting that's what used to be something that's still kind of like gray, and giving it a little bit more, a lightening up, a lightened sky. And if you could apply it to the whole image if you really wanted to. It's just all a matter of surveying your image and determining what modifications you like. And then again, if we wanted to enhance the sky, make the sky a little bit more glowing, we can add another layer, but again, making this one overlay. And then you can see how that, kind of just, it gives much more of like a glowing sky kind of a feel. So then coming back once again to, now comparing the, modified, warmer feel, fall colors kind of feel of this like ranch scenario compared to the original. So, the original has a much, I would say, sort of like colder, muted feel, which, is perfectly fine for this image. But, if the pursuit is, or if the context at which you'd like to use it or remember it, for example, is, a much warmer feeling, this is what it could look like after these kinds of modifications. All right, so now let's take a very similar approach, but let's go in the opposite direction. All right, so for this final demonstration, we're starting with what I would call a warm or a fall-ish kind of feel, and we're going to be changing it to be something a little bit more, dark or ominous, in a way, something that really just changes the feel of the way this image looks, and primarily focusing on color. So once again, to make the demonstration of the difference easier to see, we're going to duplicate, and then we are going to create a new layer group, and we'll be working within that layer group for all the changes we're going to do. Now, in this particular case, I kind of feel like the focal point is the shoes, interestingly enough. So I do want to isolate the shoes, because when I do the Hue Map thing, it's not going to work out too well in trying to preserve that. So this is kind of like what I was mentioning in the previous demo of how, depending on how Hue Map is going to affect things, you may have to mask some things out. So what I'm going to do is duplicate yet again this layer, but then now I can say in my mask button down here, say show all, holding shift once again to ignore the dialog box that may come up. And then what we have is a mask grouped with our copy. So to make this maybe a little bit easier to follow, I'm going to rename this one shoes. And then I'm going to rename this layer like the ground. And it'll be easier to see how those two things are going to play out once I do the hue map. But for now, this is kind of our setup of our layers. So with the ground layer selected, I'm going to go to Adjust, Hue and Saturation, Hue Map once again. But this time I'm going to use a separate preset. I called it Malice. For anybody who's ever played Breath of the Wild, this might make a little bit more sense to you. But it kind of reminded me of just like Malice colors. But you can see, so looking back at the whole theme, right? Color theme, all that kind of stuff like that. Everything is either sort of like a purple or a very reddish orange or a whole lot of blue, right? And so what you see how that kind of mapped out in the image is, a lot of, very purpley or indigo-y kinds of colors, and even some like reds and stuff, but essentially all like the fall-ish feel is kind of gone. But it did also have the effect of affecting the shoes, which I didn't want to be the case. So now that we've kind of gotten to this stage, what I can do is I can go to my mask, I can select my paintbrush, and I think when it comes to masks, it's really helpful to always have your colors be, white and black. It doesn't matter which order they're in, but then you can, either fully erase or fully unerase, if you will, based on whether you left click or whether you right click. And just making sure opacity is full here. You can zoom in on the shoes and maybe bring the hardness up a little bit, but just kind of paint over with black to kind of get my shoes back here. And you can see that, since I'm using a very circular shaped paintbrush, by painting to get this region, I've kind of overshot and painted over the pants. And so this is where having white is beneficial, because then now I can just paint with white in these regions to quote unquote unmask. And then I can shrink it up to kind of get these regions back here. And you can be as detailed or not detailed as you like here. Depends on the size of your image and how much that separation matters. So now, I kind of like, how this has changed, but to kind of enhance sort of the, ominousness, and the darkness of this scene that I'm really trying to create, I want to create a new raster layer. Pick sort of like a dark blue color and use the flood fill tool and just kind of fill that. And then what I want to do is change that blue layer to soft light. So then what that does is it just, kind of puts this like darkening overlay, enhances more of sort of the blue feel. It really even kind of brings down the luminance. It kind of does a lot. But whenever you do like a full color soft light blend, it's really kind of like an overlay, right? It's an overlay on the whole image. And then, kind of in concert with some of the other things we've done with the other techniques, we were always like adding brightening effects, right? Like adding glow to create like a sunset effect. So as you can imagine, if you were to select black now in this case, we are going to say selectively, add sort of like a darkening effect. We can make this layer a soft light blend, but using a really dark color like black. Low hardness once again, just so that it blends in, but then just painting, that might be a little too much, but just painting in areas where it's like you're just like, oh, I want, I really, maybe I want to take those out of focus, right? Maybe I really want to hone in on certain areas of the image, so it's almost like burning in a way. And then you have that level of control, essentially. Looking at this, though, I think the shoes, are kind of standing out a little too much. Obviously, those shoes harken back to the original warm image. So we can do a few effects on here. The first, we can add an adjustment layer of levels. And for me, when it comes to just sort of slight luminance decrease, I always like to play with just the middle slider, just because of its proportional effects on the image. And so you can see just by kind of dragging it to the right, it has the effect of darkening, if you will, the shoes. Still a little too bright in my opinion from a color perspective, so can go to another adjustment layer and go to vibrancy. And in this case, we're just going to drag to the left to try to decrease its sort of impact on the image. Because really, for me, I think the interest comes in with the colors of the ground, even though in my mind the shoes are really the focal point. Do a little bit more adjustment on levels, maybe actually drag in some of this here. All right, but if we were to do the comparison now, once again, now that we've come to the end of this sort of, malice modification of this very fall type of image, we can see, very bright, very fall colorish, warm, I would say. You get a nice warm fuzzy feeling to this sort of, what are you walking through? What world are we in, and what kind of crazy place is this, and what thing is going to jump out at me and get me? Very, very different feel, right? And primarily we've done this by adjusting color, right? Using a different sets of color, same scene, same image, all that kind of stuff. But just seeing the effects of being able to modify, mood, the feel of an image with some of these techniques. As always, if you have any questions or would like to suggest content, feel free to leave a comment. If you'd like to get updates of new videos that I post, click the subscribe button, and you can check the video description for ways to support and engage the channel, and I'll see you guys next time.